Eilvig left for the glade as the mighty soul broke the horizon. He had relived the dream again, a majestic stag elk walking proudly into the glade in the full heat of the day, the Driadie showing him where to strike, and the immense feelings of sadness and duty that accompanied it. All the people of Adelber knew of this glade. During the summer festival, they would all gather there for frolic and feast. The men would wrestle and compete in contests of skill and strength, while the women cheered and declared the winner. Aelvig had won the archery contest most years since he came of age, and had many fond memories there. It was about a 4-hour trek through the forest to get to the glade, which is why Aelvig decided to get an early start. He had 2 horses with him, knowing he would not be able to carry such a great elk back by himself. He usually only brought his bow and a quiver of arrows on a hunt, but today, since waking from his dream, he had felt an ominous dread. He could not say why, but he could not shake the feeling either. For a time, he thought to wake Matatheos and ask that he accompany him on the hunt, but he could not let the baseless fear deprive the town of their new healer, nor could he bring himself to admit to the powerful elf that he was afraid of a feeling like a child. Instead, he decided to don his war gear and going alone. The only requirement to becoming an outrider in the army was that you supply and provision yourself and your mount. This was already a steep price to pay for almost any human, and many folk in Adelber had chipped in food and supplies for him, as well as his father gifting him his 2 horses. The elf lords had given all the outriders green armbands to signify their rank, but the rest of their kit was a combination of what they could afford and family heirlooms from previous wars. The armor he wore had been his father's when he was young, and it was much better than all the other men of his town wore. He had a green padded jacket. It went down to his mid-thigh and had half-length sleeves. Over it he wore a hardened leather chest piece. It had 6 metal plates placed between layers of the leather, 4 in a square over his chest, and 2 lower to cover his abdomen. He had a leather archery bracer around his left forearm with a steel plate on the outside. Aside from this, he had a simple steel half helm. As for arms, he had a few bows of differing sizes and draw weights. For most game, he preferred a bow of medium size and strength, but for this great elk, he would have to use his heavy long bow that was about the same height that he was. Just in case, he also brought along his elven recurve style composite bow that was used for horse archery. His final gear was a plain longsword and a hunting dagger. Once he was fully equipped, he had felt a swell of courage. This armor and his superb horsemanship had kept him alive during the war, and nothing on this hunt could possibly compare to the horrors of the battlefield. He did feel a bit silly, though, and didn't want any of his fellow villagers to see him geared up for a simple hunt. So he left early and had thrown his cloak over himself and stuffed his helmet into the satchel until he was out of sight of Adelber. It was now midday, and Aelvig was very near the glade. The forest around him was thinning, and more light was spilling through the canopy. All the dew and mist of morning had burned off, and the full heat of the day was just setting in. It had taken him longer than expected to reach this spot. He had hoped to get here before midday to set up, tie his horses up, scout the area, scavenge for a snack before the elk arrived. But his plans were for naught. On his way here, his second horse kept trying to wander off and seemed to be getting frightened by some unseen creature. Also, the path through the forest was not as he remembered. A few times he knew the trail was supposed to turn one way, but today it turned the opposite way, or just kept going straight. Aelvig thought he was losing his mind. He had made this trek half 100 times and couldn't figure out what was happening. As his horse trotted down the path, Aelvig finally caught a glimpse of the glade, just beyond the thinning tree line before him. He dismounted and found a tree with a low branch that he tied his 2 horses to. He then pulled his long bow from his pack on the horse's saddle. He strung the bow and pulled a single arrow from his quiver. The wood elf had shown him where to hit the elk. 1 arrow was all he would need. Aelvig then walked slowly to the tree line. Once he got to the edge of the glade, he hunkered down and observed. He noticed he was at the exact same spot that he had been in the dream. First time I've felt right all day, he thought to himself with mild irritation. As he scanned the glade, he saw something at the back that made his heart freeze in his chest for a second. It was an exact recreation of Adelber's Long Hall, flanked by two houses. This glade was a sacred spot for the people of Adelber, and they had agreed not to build on it. It was a place of worship and communion with divine soul, not to be owned by any man or family. Who then had built these structures? Since it looked exactly like Adelber, was it someone from there? Or was it a rival moving into their territory? All Aelvig knew was that the elk must wait. This had to be investigated. He was now glad that he had his war gear, and that his horse, or sorry, with that his horse, with that and his horse, he could be a match for a number of commoners. He raced back to his horse and prepared it for skirmish. First, he opened his saddlebag and took out his helmet, donning it quickly. He then took off the hunting pack and gear, keeping only what was needed in a fight. The rest he packed onto his second horse. He then strung his composite bow, moved his longsword from its mount on the saddle to his hip, and then jumped onto the horse. They burst out of the tree line, headed straight for the building at the far side of the glade. Aelvig felt his heart in his throat, and his mind raced with possibilities. He knocked an arrow onto his bowstring and tried to remember his army training. He knew in the wide open glade he would have an advantage of speed and mobility, but he would also have no cover and no way to hide his advance in the wide open glade. As he came up to the building, he saw no sign of life. No smoke from the chimney, no clothes hanging to dry, no sounds at all. He also noticed the door to the great hall was wide open. Aelvig circled the buildings twice on his steed, searching for clues. He then called out, I am Aelvig, son of Leofric. This land is held by Adelber in the name of our good lord and by the grace of Sol Invicta. Show yourself now, and I swear on the honor of my people that you will not be harmed. There was no movement, no response. He galloped close to the nearby tree line to see if any had hidden there or waited in ambush. Again, he saw and heard nothing. He rode his horse back around to the front of the longhouse, dismounted, and drew his longsword. He walked up to the open doorway and peered inside. There was a long table running down the middle, with chairs and stools alongside it, but it was otherwise completely empty. He called out once more, I'm coming in. I mean you no harm, but I will defend myself. As he stepped inside, he felt a rush of warmth hit his body. Not heat, but a feeling of safety. He then saw the wood elf sitting in a chair at the far end of the long hall. It was not there just a second ago, and Aelvig thought he should be afraid, but he only felt calm. He sheathed his sword and walked down the table to take a seat opposite the elf. Once he sat and locked eyes with the wood elf, he felt the same rush of emotion and swirling thoughts in his head as before. But last time, the swirling thoughts and emotions coalesced into meaning. This time, before that happened, the elf opened his mouth and spoke. We are glad you have come, young one. We are saddened to have tricked you, but little choice was left us. Aelvig looked around the room and replied, I've seen no other beings. Why are you saying we? Did you build these houses? 1,000 other questions filled his mind, but he only got those two out before a calming breeze rushed the thoughts from his head. We Driadie are never truly alone, even in our own minds. Yes, we built these structures recently. We have much to explain, but just now you will not want the answers, said the wood elf. Of course I want the answers, sputtered Aelvig before regaining his composure. I've come all the way based on the dream you sent me. Could you explain why you brought me here at least? He asked. The wood elf closed his eyes and let out a small sigh. When it opened its eyes again, Aelvig felt an outpouring of sadness and compassion. The wood elf then locked eyes with him again, and his head began to spin. He felt danger and fear, and then the swirls in his mind focused, and his heart froze. Aelvig jumped to his feet and yelled, "When will this happen?" But as he yelled it, he realized he already knew the answer. Adelbur, his home, was ablaze, and he was not there to help.